Kia ora everybody, thanks very much for the chance to be here. I quite like getting a little bit older. The thing about getting older is that people cut you a bit of slack and don't mind if you get a bit grumpy about a few things. I quite enjoy being a curmudgeon and having the leeway to do that. And one of the things that really irritates me is actually the word resilience. I've got to say, it's one of those words that can mean whatever you want it to mean, and it's become the new sustainability in terms of a buzzword. And in a kind of cruel twist of fate, we just had a restructure at the Wellington City Council, and my new job title is the Manager of Resilience and Sustainability. So you can imagine how cynical I was when Wellington became a member of this gig, the 100 Resilient Cities, sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation out of the US. I've got to say that cynicism was quickly washed away when they gave us basically a gift of value of US $1 million to help us to produce a resilience strategy. And one of the first things they did was fly me to Mexico City along with 99 other resilience officers to get together to talk about stuff of mutual interest around the world. And initially I thought San Francisco, Christchurch, Bristol in the UK would be the kind of places we would go to get inspiration, but actually I was wrong. A couple of the major cities that have given us inspiration have been, there's a city and you've probably never heard of in Indonesia called Semarang, a village of 1.5 million people on the island of Java. And I got chatting to the guy from Java who was having no luck at all trying to get people to talk about resilience in Java. So what he did, he kind of thought completely left field. He went and hired Miss Indonesia, and he made Miss Indonesia a resilience ambassador. I'm not making this up. He made her a resilience ambassador. Next thing you know, in Semarang, everybody is talking about resilience. We briefly thought about hiring Miss Wellington, but figured that probably wouldn't be a good use of ratepayer money. But what it did was make us think about different ways of getting our message across. And if you get a chance to have a look at our resilience strategy, it's actually based on a comic, graphic novel, because we knew that, how many people actually read council strategies anyway? We've got a much better chance of getting cut through by getting people to have a look at a graphic novel, something that's a bit different. So it's been really useful being part of a global network that gives us inspiration and clever ideas and new ways of thinking, new cultures and new exposure from all around the world. The other thing about Rockefeller is what they made us do, they made us follow a disciplined process. Like most Kiwi blokes, we kind of like to just get stuff done and not follow the instructions. So it's actually quite useful for us to be told to follow the instructions and have an instruction book. And I'm not going to take you through that in detail, but there are a couple of important things they made us do. The first thing was around leadership. They made us, before we did any work at all, set up a governance group that was going to oversee the whole strategy process and make sure that when we wanted to do stuff, that we had a bunch of leaders that could actually get that stuff done. So they insisted that the mayor chair the steering group, and we were really, really grateful that the Insurance Council Chief Executive Tim Grafton joined us as a key member of that steering group, because you can't talk about resilience in Wellington or anywhere in New Zealand without talking about insurance. So we see it as an integral part of Wellington's resilience journey, if you like, although journey is another one of those words like sustainability and resilience, isn't it? The other thing they made us do is they insisted that we listen to people and people's aspirations with respect to resilience. I spent years in the army, and I got used to writing orders that people would follow, and I knew they would follow them. You can't do that in a city. Kiwis will actually give you the fingers and do the opposite, just to spite you, rather than do what the local authority tells them to do. So we realised early on, and Rockefeller insisted that we get people together to make sure this was a community exercise and not the council barking at people. And it was really important because we found having these discussions that you ask an engineer what he or she means about resilience. Normally it's about the thickness of the asphalt or the size of the pipe or the size of the cable. Or if you ask an accountant, it's always about the strength of the balance sheet. If you ask someone from your sector, it's always about kind of catastrophic loss models, that kind of stuff. And if you ask someone from the social sector, it's always about personal resilience and your ability to bounce back personally from something bad that's happened to you. So everybody has their own view on what resilience is. So our challenge was to define resilience for Wellington. So it was really important that we got these 200 people together to enable us to do that. To do that, we had to look back at where Wellington had come from. And even the most hard-bitten Aucklander will have to appreciate that Wellington actually, on a good day, is a lovely place to be. A couple of stories about how that happened. The one I like the most is the Taniwha story. So Māori say that Wellington was in fact a lake before it became a harbour, and that in that lake these two Taniwha lived. Their names were Ngākei and Whātaitai. They got bored swimming around and around and around the lake, so one day the skinny one, Ngake, decided to jump over the edge of the lake into the Pacific Ocean to swim around and find fortune. And he did that. He worked up all of his energy, all his momentum, jumped over the edge of the lake, and to this day they say he is in the Pacific Ocean catching fish and having a whale of a time. His brother, Whātaitai, was a bit plumper. It took him a bit longer to work up the guts to do it. And when he did, he was a bit slower and didn't quite make it, and he crashed on the edge of the rocks, and thereby splitting open the heads to the harbour today. But the tide had gone out, so he was stuck there. And they say to this day that Whātaitai forms the Miramar Peninsula, and that his horns are the Barrett's Reef where the Wahine struck. Fantastic, rich, resilient story. Of course, geologists and scientists have a different version of how Wellington was, much less interesting version. But if you think about Wellington's there because of the beautiful hills, the harbour, the reason the hills are there are because two tectonic plates that are crushing together, and we can't stop that. And it's going to happen again in the future. And the ocean is changing the way the city looks as well. And of course, we have first-hand experience of this. Starting in 1855, just in modern times, in 1855, the Basin Reserve, the world's finest cricket ground, was previously known as the Basin Lake. And the earthquake actually raised it 5 metres above where it was before. And of course, gave us not just a beautiful cricket ground, but that earthquake also gave us a rim of land around the edge of the harbour. And I've got to say, on that land, we promptly put all of our roads, pipes, cables, houses, and other infrastructure. So Wellington is honestly, literally built on the fault line. During those days, of course, we built a bunch of social resilience as well. Through 2 world wars, New Zealand troops and Wellington regiments in particular performed admirably, but with great social loss. During the Second War, of course, New Zealand's forgotten earthquake, the Masterton earthquake. Masterton was munted by this earthquake. Honestly, it had to be completely rebuilt. It also affected Wellington. We lost 10,000 chimneys in Wellington as a result of the Masterton earthquake. And of course, EQC, what we know today as the EQC, was a result of the Masterton earthquake and the damage in Wellington that took years and years and years to actually repair. Kind of haunts me a bit, but the civic leaders of Masterton at the time said, geez, that was lucky, that was at night time. If that had been during the day, hundreds of people would have died. And of course, the reason that haunts me is October 2010 in Christchurch, and I've got to say, December last year in Kaikoura in Wellington. Got these warnings that Mother Nature keeps giving us. We've had other disasters, of course. We've learnt from them. And if you can just indulge me for a minute, when I was in the army, I'm old enough to have kind of served with guys who served in Vietnam. I didn't serve in Vietnam, not quite that old. But the guys that came back from Vietnam used to tell these stories about the VC, the Viet Cong, the enemy. These little people in black pyjamas that were really tough and would kind of come out of nowhere and ambush you and then disappear back into the undergrowth. And it kind of, in my mind for years and years, that was what the Vietnamese people were and what Vietnam was. And of course, that was a really unpopular war. And Wellington, as usual, was kind of leading the charge in terms of demonstrating their unpopularity. But years later, a couple of years ago, I went to Hanoi and we popped in to see Ho Chi Minh is still lying in state there. And we queued up with thousands of Vietnamese people to see Ho Chi Minh, who are still revered in Vietnam. And this is my young kid, the chubby little fellow. And we got talking to some people in the queue to see Ho Chi Minh. These lovely old gentlemen, I got kind of communicating with them. We couldn't really speak with each other, language barrier. But it turned out that these guys actually were North Vietnamese army who were fighting against my friends who had served in the New Zealand army. And actually, this was Charlie. This was the Viet Cong. These were the guys that actually I had imagined in my mind were some kind of monsters who lived in mud and kind of came out of the undergrowth. And it kind of struck me, what struck me about that is how quickly things change. And in half a generation, we've gone from being mortal enemies with someone to being these gentlemen who kind of kept doing this to my kid. He hated it, by the way. But just astonishing how quickly things change. And I think that's relevant today because I just think that our approach to natural hazards and earthquakes in particular has changed a whole bunch. And it's going to continue to change really quickly, real period of change at the moment. And I think it's an opportunity for us. Of course, we had other social upheaval as well. And all of this stuff was kind of useful grist to the mill when you're producing a resilient strategy, because that stuff all goes in at the start of the strategy development process, goes through this kind of, this machine, if you like, of processes, and then with these 200 people, at the other end pops the things that we really need to worry about. So 3 simple statements, but this took us hours and hours and hours of work to settle on. For Wellington, it's about change and movement. Three things on the move, three systems on the move. The first one, and probably the trickiest one, is our society is changing, man. We're getting older, we're becoming more diverse, and we're having to live in different ways. And what we keep doing in Wellington and New Zealand is we keep planning cities for the way we have lived in the past, rather than planning cities for the way our grandchildren are going to live. Now, it's a big issue for us in Wellington because we haven't got any space, so we're going to have to change the way that we live. So our society is really transforming, and we need to think hard about that, and we have some key decisions to make at the moment. In Wellington, at least, and for a good 2/3 of New Zealand, we know we're going to have a big earthquake at some point. Wellington, we have no excuse. We're made by earthquakes. We know we're going to have a big one at some stage, and the sea is rising. I think, generally speaking, in New Zealand, we have an understanding that that is a fact, and that we have to start thinking about how we're going to adapt ourselves to deal with that. Probably Auckland probably looking to lead on that, with you guys being more affected than most of the other big cities. I'll come on to that in a moment, though. So we decided, as an aim, that we wanted all Wellingtonians to not just survive, but to thrive after each of those changes. And the key word here actually is everyone. So it's not just the majority, it's everyone. And what that means is it focuses us on our most vulnerable people, are the ones that we start with when it comes to resilience. We gave ourselves 3 goals. The first goal is that we want people to be connected and empowered. Nigel was talking about social isolation as being a blight these days, and every 6 months or so, there's a horrible story about some elderly person who's died alone in their, usually social housing, alone and afraid. And I think that's it's a bit of a symptom and a warning signal for us, and we're really keen to make sure that doesn't happen. For us, that's doubly important because we know that we're going to have 50 to 80,000 people living in the city, and in Wellington, it's mostly going to be in the CBD. And if it's mostly going to be in the CBD, then the people are going to be living in buildings like this, either medium density or high density building. When people live that way, it's much, much harder to build resilience than it is if you're living in the suburbs. You don't stick your head over the fence to talk to your neighbour who's mowing the lawns or having a barbecue. And maybe I'm romanticising about where I grew up in Christchurch, but life is not like that anymore, and it won't be in the future. And we have to think hard about how we build resilience into communities that are largely got vertical construction. The second thing is it's all about information. I think there's some really clever instrumentation that's really cheap now, and so for us in Wellington with these clever accelerometers and things, we can actually make ourselves into a city of models, a city that understands how its commercial buildings have behaved, understands the risk, and can quickly tell people whether or not a building's safe after an earthquake. So we're really keen on that, and really keen on sharing that information. It's not so much having the knowledge, it's how we share it and how people can make their decisions based on this knowledge. And more practically, after the earthquake, the government passed some regulations to enable us to require building owners to undertake some really quite detailed and expensive testing of their buildings. Some of you will have been involved in this, the targeted damage evaluations. There's an issue with Wellington in particular, but a nationwide issue around hollow core floors, so precast concrete flooring that was popular back in the 80s. And during the earthquake, a lot of those floors cracked and cracked quite badly. The cracking itself doesn't mean that the buildings are in danger of imminent collapse. Far from it, that's not the issue at all. The issue is that we think that buildings that have this kind of cracking, and there are 155 in Wellington, will struggle to get a really good NBS rating. We think they'll probably struggle to get above about 67%. The problem with that is, in Wellington, most people are demanding 80 to 100%, and that expectation is only getting higher and higher and higher, that buildings will be as close to 100% as possible. So that gives us a problem, of course. And you can't fix that problem overnight. It's going to take many, many years before we get our building stock to where the market's expecting it. Other knowledge that we have that we're really kind of turning our minds to how we share this knowledge. This is a flyover, not a real flyover. This is a virtual flyover of Wellington. The deeper the yellow colour is the steeper the terrain. The reason this is important for Wellington, the steeper the terrain, when you add water or earth shaking to that terrain, you've got a greater risk of landslide. And landslide's probably landslide is the biggest hazard that we face in Wellington, no matter how that is caused. And just the rain that over this last winter caused, I think, close to 1,000 landslides in Wellington. Not all of them were big, of course, but where the poles are is where the big extensive ones were that closed roads and we had to evacuate buildings. My point is, we have this knowledge, we have this information. We think that anyone who comes to work, live or play in Wellington should have access to this knowledge so that they can make their decisions accordingly. And the same applies to tsunami and all the other natural perils as well. So we're turning our minds to how you might actually share that information with people, and how you might do it in a way that doesn't scare the pants off them, but makes them aware that there is a hazard that they need to think about when they come to our city. And finally, and kind of the sexy goal, I suppose, is around our homes and our infrastructure, making sure that they are healthy and robust. And it's no secret that if we have our big shake in Wellington, parts of Wellington will be without water for up to 100 days. So at the moment, if you fly over Wellington, have a look for this rig's currently drilling for water off the Miramar Peninsula. We actually found some water off the peninsula. It needs treatment, but we're trying to find different ways that we can actually provide water into downtown Wellington that are cheaper and quicker than sticking a pipeline across the harbour. I have to say the government stepped up, so NZTA, Ministry of Transport, really stepped up with a 10-year plan for investment in Wellington's roading infrastructure. Really keen to make sure we look at other modes of transport as well, including the sea. The sea is our free highway, if you like. We don't really exploit it in Wellington. In 2020, there's a bunch of consultation going to happen on some really key and cool stuff around Wellington's transport. And one of the tricky things for us is our electricity network is owned by a guy in Hong Kong. So in terms of getting him to understand how we need to invest in resilience in Wellington for a 1 in 500 year event, when this life of the asset is only 50 years, is really difficult. But we had some real movement on that just in the last week, where the Commerce Commission and MB are going to work with Wellington Electricity to allow them to fiddle with their pricing so they can actually invest $30 million into Wellington's electricity network. So we're really pleased about that all of the major infrastructure owners are actually starting to invest heavily in our infrastructure and our resilience. And this is all based on good science and good information. So Erica didn't mention one of the things that she's involved with is the merits tool, measuring the economics of resilience and infrastructure tool, which is a joint venture that Erica can tell you all about. But we're making sure that all of this investment is based on really, really good understanding of the economics of failure of infrastructure in Wellington. It's actually quite compelling, but you need to do it in a way that is based on good science and the best evidence available. So engineers kind of really get off on all that stuff, but actually there's no point having good infrastructure if we can't go home. During the Kaikoura earthquake, between 5,000 and 7,000 Wellingtonians couldn't go to their normal place of work, which is a bit inconvenient. Entirely different prospect if you can't go to where you normally normally live. So we're spending a lot of time and energy trying to get homeowners to think about the resilience of their homes. In the resilience strategy, we have 30 projects. 5 of those are based on our homes. And one of the key aspects to that is actually improving Wellingtonians' insurance literacy. It's the kind of thing, a bit like Nigel when he's talking with his terms and conditions for visiting Iraq. People don't worry about it until the time comes, and it's probably too late. So we're really keen, and really pleased to have Tim on board and John Lucas from the council looking at insurance literacy in Wellington and the steps that we can take to improve the literacy. It's not all about earthquakes though. We have big issues with seawater already in Wellington. Parts of Miramar don't drain away as they ought to drain away. Parts of the Hutt Valley also flood regularly. So we're trying to pull this stuff together so we've got an integrated picture of resilience and where we need to be investing. I've got to say, where you can invest in stuff that has co-benefits, be it improving people's day-to-day lives through better commuting, better roads, fewer outages of water, then that is the opportunity for us to invest in resilience. There are a couple of key questions that have to be answered with all this stuff. Who pays and who gets to make decisions, especially when it comes to sea level rise? So while the former Prime Minister was very happy to launch our resilience strategy, there are still some key national issues that need to be addressed. We know that nationally, Department of Prime Minister is looking at a national resilience strategy, but it is very civil defence based. When something bad happens, as Erica said, it's actually quite easy to get people fired up to do something. The trick with all this stuff is to get people to do stuff before something's happened. That's a much tougher gig, and that's the prospect we're faced with in Wellington at the moment. Can be done though, and the way we're trying to do it is by telling stories. In this resilience strategy, as I mentioned, we have a graphic novel. What the graphic novel does is it fast forwards 30 years' time, when Wellington's lived through an earthquake, some sea level rise and some big social change, and it reflects on the decisions we're taking this decade and thanks us for the decisions that we took because it will benefit our grandchildren. A couple of things there. One is the graphic novel, people read that, and the second thing is if you talk about their grandchildren and children, that kind of gets their attention as well. So we're talking about legacy here and making sure that we're thinking about the future, just not thinking about how we live now. In this particular example, this chapter of the novel talks about the earthquake. It thanks us for having had the courage to earthquake strength in our buildings this decade. It thanks us for having had the foresight to think about insurance. In fact, that panel is all about insurance. And it thanks us for taking the opportunities to build Wellington back better. But most of all, it focuses on people. So as I've been saying throughout, with resilience, people tend to focus on balance sheets, on actuarial models, on engineering stuff, but actually the only reason we have any of that stuff is so that people can work, live and play in our cities. So we're really keen that that remains the focus of resilience, and really happy that we're deeply engaged with Tim and John in that regard for Wellington's resilience strategy. Thank you very much indeed. Cheers.